Hello and welcome to Sam-Splaining Science. I'm Sam, I'm your host. I'll be Sam-Splaining the science, and today we're talking about exercise. I know, I know, but don't leave. Stay with me, please. I promise it'll be good. It'll be fun. But before we get into it, as always, I want to catch up and say hi and how are you? It's been a little while. I feel like my MO at this point is to drop an episode and then disappear for 3 months. But hey, we're back. I have a new laptop, which hopefully records at a similar, if not better quality than the old one that crapped out on me. And we're going to be talking science as usual because science is important and because learning about science is fun. But yeah, I hope you've been well. I hope you've been good. Happy springtime. It's a beautiful spring day in New York. My windows are open, so apologies for any background noise that you might hear. But it is officially WOW. And WOW stands for Windows Open Weather. So my windows are wide open. And I hope yours are too, because it is WOW. But yeah, I hope you're good. Hope you're enjoying the start to spring if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, that is. But yeah, happy to be back. Hope you missed me. Just kidding. You're like, Sam, I didn't even realize you were gone. Girl, boy, person, I get it. I hear you. But I'm back and looking forward to it. So, as I mentioned, today we're talking about exercise. And before we get into the science, I did want to be a little bit vulnerable. Ew, I know being vulnerable is gross, but I wanted to be real and be honest, and vulnerable. As gross as it is, I feel like it's a good way to connect with people. So here I am being vulnerable. Growing up, I always saw exercise as a punishment. For those of you who might not know me in real life, I am not a skinny girl. I'm not physically fit or athletic or anything of that sort. You can use a lot of words to describe me. Skinny is not one of them. It never has been. It never will be. But when I was growing up, I always really struggled with my body image, and because of that, I saw exercise as a way to reconcile with me being overweight. And I would run on the treadmill if I thought I ate too much. I would do sit-ups until I was nauseous to make my belly smaller, and just, it was never, exercise for me as a young person really never came from a place of happiness or joy or even neutrality. It always came from a place of negativity, of frankly hating myself and my body. And that's really not a nice way to go about exercise. But that was my reality for most of my life. My motivation for exercise was basically me being my biggest bully. That is until the past couple of years, I would say. Over the past few years, I've learned a lot about exercise and exactly how exercise helps to keep every organ system in your body healthy, right? And ever since that, I've reframed my motivation surrounding exercise to be less of a focus on my body and the way that it looks, and more of a focus on my body and the way that it functions and the way that it, I guess, functions is the word, the only word that I think of. Yeah. It's just, I want to make sure that I am strong, fast, not because I want to fit into a certain size jeans, but because I want to make sure that I'm treating my body nicely. And that's the the switch between those two mindsets for me, shockingly, was learning the science and understanding the science behind exercise and its impact on all of these different body systems. Because now I care more about focusing on my brain health, my heart, muscle, bone health versus what I look like. And that's, thinking about it in that light has made it a lot easier for me to stay active, to get active. So I figured I would share what I've learned with you all. And maybe if your brain works the way mine did up until a few years ago, this can help you kind of shift a perspective to a more neutral or positive mindset surrounding exercise. But yeah, exercise, as we've been told 1,000 times, is very good for you. And it has a lot of benefits to, like I said, pretty much every part of your body and all the different organ systems in your body. And I'd love to chat about all of them. But for today, I'm going to focus on the brain because I love the brain. So with that, we'll get into today's questions. There are 2 questions that we're going to talk about in today's episode. The first one is, what are the short-term effects of exercise on the brain? And the second is, what are the long-term effects of exercise on the brain? So as always, the sources for this episode are going to be linked in the episode description. For each of the questions, we're going to be referring to a review paper, which will be cited, again, in the episode description, but also on the slide if you're watching on YouTube. So with that, let's get into it. To question number 1. So when I'm thinking about when I mean short-term effect of exercise on the brain, what I mean here is not, I hope it's kind of self-explanatory, but for me, I'm thinking about if I exercise today for the first time, what is happening right now? Like if I exercised an hour ago, what's going on in my brain right now? It's more of like a short term. In the literature, they call it acute exercise. Basically just like one singular bout of exercise, one workout. If you worked out today, what is happening in your brain? And there are actually a lot of studies in both animal models and in humans that suggest that acute exercise has a slight, but positive effect on cognitive function. So that's things like your attention, memory, problem solving, those sorts of things. This review article that was written by Basso and Suzuki, which again is linked below, they cite a bunch of different papers that all kind of look at different studies that looked at exercise and cognitive function. But the findings are kind of variable. And one of the attributes to the variable findings is the fact that different studies classify different things as exercise, right? So depending on the study, they could have the people that are participating in the study doing very high intensity exercise or very low intensity exercise, or exercising for 20 minutes or 2 hours. And there's a lot of variability within the studies themselves that could have caused these variable findings in the effects of exercise on cognition. But even with this variability, there have been 3 pretty consistent findings when it comes to the effects of acute exercise or short-term effects of exercise on the brain. And the first of those 3 consistent findings is improvements on cognitive tasks that depend on the prefrontal cortex, or the PFC. So the prefrontal cortex is at the very front of your brain. It's like right where your forehead is. And it is responsible for functions like decision-making, problem-solving, planning, executive functions. They're like higher level functions that we actually think about, versus a different area of the brain, like the sensory motor area, where we don't really have to think about sensing things, but that's a different story. Anyway, so the prefrontal cortex is really important when we're thinking about planning, executive functions, problem solving, those sorts of examples. And the literature really supports the idea that after exercise, and in this particular example, it's going to be a cardio workout, the performance of different tasks that depend on the prefrontal cortex improve after this cardio workout. So this example study had a 2-hour, the workout itself was 50 minutes of intense stationary bike cycling, with a 5-minute warm up, then the 50 minutes of intense cycling, then 5-minute cool down. 2 minutes. Girl, believe it or not, I did exercise today. And my brain is this bad. Can you believe? It's fine. 2 hours after that cardio workout, the participants in the study did a Stroop test. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Stroop test, but it's basically when participants are shown a word. It doesn't always have to be a word, but in our case, we'll say they're shown a word that is a color, and the text of that word is a different color. So for example, you'll be reading the word blue, but the color of the letters is orange. And then the task is to say, what color is the text of this word? So you're looking at the word blue, but your correct answer is orange. And that's kind of where the prefrontal cortex really gets tested, where you actually have to think about this, right? It's not like a reflex answer of like, oh, it's obviously this or that. It's like, oh, I'm reading one thing, but I'm seeing a different color, and I need to process that information and give you a different color back, right? So it's kind of complicated. It sounds kind of stupid, but when you do it, you're like, oh, this is challenging. This is hard. And the whole point is to do it quickly too. You're not supposed to sit there and like really think about it. Like you have to answer. So it's definitely a challenge. And what they found is that after this 1-hour cardio workout, specifically 2 hours after this cardio workout, the performance on this cognitive test, this Stroop test to test the prefrontal cortex function, was improved in people who exercised. And they compared this to people who did not exercise and instead watched a video. And their performance was not as good as the people who exercised. Basically saying that this short-term impact of exercise was improved prefrontal cortex function. The second consistent finding, you're like, oh, brother, Sam, we're only on number 2. Girl, boy, person, I know. This is my first time back in a while. I am in the mood to yap, and I'm going to yap. And I have my notes here, and I might go off my notes. I might be over here, and my notes are down here, and I'm somewhere else completely. This is what happens when I don't talk to you for 3 months. We got to catch up. And by catch up, I mean I got to ramble. I got to get my chit chats out. It happens. Anyway, another consistent finding that the literature has shown when it comes to the short-term effects of exercise on cognition is that exercise can enhance mood or affect. So there are a lot of studies reporting both enhanced or increased positive mood, so like feeling even more happy, right? But then also reporting decreased negative moods, so feeling less sad. You see how those are like kind of different, but they're kind of the same thing, you know? But multiple studies have looked at both and the impact of exercise for up to 24 hours on mood, and have reported enhanced positive moods and decreased negative moods. And specifically, one study found that the largest impacts of acute exercise on mood were the decreases on negative moods. So decreases in feelings of depression, tension, anger, confusion. So exercise short term really helps to decrease the negative feelings that or moods that people might be feeling. And it's not clear exactly what relationships are between the changes in mood and the type of exercise, the intensity, the duration. But one study that was cited in the review, low powered, albeit it was only 10 people per group. But one study suggested that the effects of acute exercise on mood were the greatest when the people got to choose the intensity of their exercise, which to me makes sense because sometimes if you're like angry and you're like, I need to punch a punching bag, like I need to get my rage out, right? Like I would choose to go to maybe a boxing class or something. But then there are some times where you have negative moods and you're like, I just need to go for a walk. You know, I just need to go get some fresh air. And it's not as intense. And you think about like, maybe you feel the same way when you're in those moments where you're like really angry and you need to punch something. If someone was like, go take a walk. If someone told me to take a walk when I was in the mood to punch something, they're the thing that I'm about to punch. You know what I mean? And maybe that's a problem that I have to work out with a therapist. And I can do that for sure. Because that is reminiscent of some anger issues that are deeper. But I don't know. It just makes more sense to me that like when you're in those feelings of like negative moods, choosing your outlet will increase the impact that exercise has on decreasing those negative moods. That felt like a whole lot of word vomit, but do you know what I mean? Hopefully you agree. Hopefully you're kind of on the same page and you don't think I'm a complete wackadoo. But even if you do, I can't control that. I can just control my own wackadoo self. Okay, so that was the second consistent finding. The first was the cognition in the prefrontal cortex was improved. The second consistent finding was that there was enhanced mood and affect. Now let's move on to the third consistent finding, which is that acute exercise decreases stress level. Now, the way that they measured stress in this study that was cited in the review was looking at blood pressure and heart rate. So really looking at cardiac responses to stress, kind of like a proxy. So it wasn't like, oh, I feel less stressed in this moment. It was more of like a biological measurement of stress response. And what the study found, well, basically what they did was they measured blood pressure and heart rate during various tasks after people had exercised. And essentially what they found was that the responses to stress were lower after exercise. So the tasks, for example, would be taking somebody's heart rate and blood pressure while they're giving a speech, like public speaking. Another example was the cold pressor test, where I don't know if you've heard of the cold pressor test. It's not very pleasant. You basically put your hand in cold water for as long as you can, and you can't take it out until you absolutely have to take it out. And maybe that doesn't sound so awful. But in one of my labs in college, we did the cold pressor test and it gets painful. Like it physically hurts your hand to hold it in ice water for too long. So as your hand is in ice water, you're like feeling pain. And of course, your heart rate and your blood pressure are going to respond to that stressor. So in this study, what they found was that the physical stress responses to the cold pressor test were lower after exercise, and specifically after 3 hours after exercise, I should say. So that's another consistent finding, is that exercise decreases stress levels and stress responses. So that's all of the effects of the short-term effects of exercise on cognitive function. That's part 1 of question 1. So for the second part of question 1, where we're still talking about short-term effects of exercise on the brain, we're going to think about the effect of acute exercise on brain function. So less on cognitive, behavior, mood, and more on like, what is the brain actually doing after exercise or during exercise, right? And there are a bunch of different ways to study brain function, like with I always stumble over this word, so give me a second. Electroencephalography. That's an EEG. You can call it EEG if you're a coward, but some of us pronounce the whole word, maybe with some challenges, but we do it. So you can use an EEG. we pronounce it once and then we move on just to prove that we could do it. And then we say EEG. And then another way to look at brain function or to measure brain function is with something like a functional MRI, where you can actually look at the brain and see the activity changes under a certain task. Another way to study brain function is using functional near-infrared spectroscopy, or FNIRS. I think people call it FNIRS or FNIRS. I'm going to call it FNIRS because I think that's what I've heard it as. And if I'm wrong, don't mention it. Just pretend I'm right, okay? That's like the worst thing to do in science. Just pretend I'm right. Don't worry about it. Just pretend I'm right. Anyway, so FNIRS, what is that? It's basically you can wear a cap of sorts that has lights on the inside of it. So the lights are kind of like touching your scalp. And those lights will project through your scalp. And then they can basically measure the blood flow in the brain based on the way that oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood refract the light back to the cap. It's kind of trippy. It seems very physicsy. But that's basically a way that they can measure brain activity, because when a brain region is active, it's going to be demanding a lot of oxygenated blood and then using that oxygen for energy. And then there will be a lot of deoxygenated blood leaving that area of the brain. So they can measure oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, which is pretty interesting. So specifically, FNIRS has been used to test Dietrich's reticular activating hypofrontality theory of exercise. What is that, Sam? Let me tell you. During exercise, the brain's energy during exercise is focused on areas that coordinate our movements, right? Whether we're riding a bike or we're running or we're lifting weights, there are going to be regions of our brain that need oxygen and need blood flow to coordinate those movements. Those are regions like the motor cortex. I'm recording on a Mac, and you know how sometimes on the Mac, like if you hold your thumb up, it like does the thumbs up emoji. I'm like, I didn't mean to do that. I just talk with my hands a lot. Anyway. So during exercise, there are regions of your brain that are coordinating the movement that might demand more oxygenated blood, because you need to balance, you need to bend your leg in a certain way or bend your arm in a certain way. And you need to like coordinate those movements. So those parts of your brain, sorry for the freaking motorcyclist outside my window. But those parts of your brain are going to demand more energy while you're coordinating those movements, right? Like the motor cortex, and also the cerebellum, which is at the very base of our brain, that coordinates balance and other like motor coordination. So those regions of our brain might require increased blood flow during exercise, whereas maybe the prefrontal cortex won't need as much blood flow, right? Because maybe we're not trying to solve a math problem, or maybe we're not trying to plan something in that moment. We're really focusing on the activity that we're doing. So the idea is that during exercise, there will be less blood flow or hypoperfusion to the prefrontal cortex in areas that are maybe higher order, and more blood flow, hyperperfusion, to areas that coordinate the movement, the motion, during the exercise. But then after exercise, the prefrontal cortex, which was previously hypoperfused, that wasn't getting that much, well, it was getting blood. Obviously, you're not like cutting off oxygen supply to every part of your brain, but it's calling for less oxygenated blood because it's not as active. So because the prefrontal cortex was hypoperfused, had less blood demand, the theory is here that that region will have like a rebound surge of oxygenated blood after exercise. And that is thought to enhance the function of the prefrontal cortex. So with this FNIRS technology, studies have shown that moderate exercise improved, or rather increased, blood flow to the frontal regions of the brain after exercise. So really supporting this hypothesis, this theory of reticular activating hypofrontality, by looking at the oxygenated, deoxygenated blood after exercise, and showing that in the prefrontal cortex, there is this sort of surge of oxygenated blood after exercise. Additionally, this study that showed the increased blood flow to the frontal parts of the brain, they also showed that was in line with improvements in the Stroop task, which again is that task that tests the executive functioning that the prefrontal cortex does of determining the color of the color word. Loopy. But in any case, this basically just shows that functionally in the brain, during exercise, there are regions of the brain that require more energy than others, and that this kind of sets the stage for improved function after exercise, because the brain kind of has to compensate for the hypoperfusion of certain regions during exercise. So I thought that was pretty interesting. And hopefully you did too. And if not, sorry. I don't know what to tell you. You don't have to stay here. I'm not holding you hostage. That's not how you grow an audience, Sam. That's not the way to do it. It's okay. So we talked about cognition and behavior and mood changes after a bout of exercise. We talked about brain function and different regions that activate during and after exercise. Now let's talk about how acute exercise affects our neurochemistry. So neurotransmitters, you may have heard of this term before. They're basically chemicals in our brains that make them work the way that they do, right? These are chemical signals that brain cells send to one another within and across brain regions that can either activate or deactivate certain brain functions. And the paper by Basso and Suzuki really goes into a lot of detail here, but I'm just going to hit a couple of points because I know I'm already talking so much and we're still on question 1. I know, I'm sorry. But I'm just going to try to bump through these real quick. Good luck. Okay. Cortisol. People on TikTok love cortisol. I might clip this part and put it on TikTok so that I can go viral because people are obsessed with it for some reason. Cortisol is a hormone that's known as our stress hormone. One of or some of its functions include stress responses, regulating stress responses. It impacts our immune function. It impacts our metabolism. It can impact sleep-wake cycles. A lot of things, right? But where does cortisol come from, and how does exercise affect cortisol? So exercise activates an area of our brain called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus has a couple of different roles. One thing that it does is it regulates hunger, it regulates body temperature, sleep-wake cycles, things like that. And one of its functions is actually to create or make a hormone that's called the corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. And the CRH that's produced by the hypothalamus hops over to the pituitary, which is another area of our brain. And CRH makes the pituitary create another hormone called the adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. So the pituitary releases ACTH, and then the ACTH floats on down to our adrenal glands, which are actually not in our brain. They sit right on top of our kidneys. So the ACTH floats through the bloodstream down to the kidneys, and it causes the kidneys to make cortisol. So the activation of the hypothalamus caused by exercise leads to this multi-step process that eventually ends up with the creation, the generation of cortisol from the adrenal glands in the kidneys. So in humans, this process of creating cortisol, which is through the HPA axis, that's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, that kind of has this multi-step process to eventually make cortisol. This has been shown to be intensity dependent. So studies have shown increases in cortisol that can occur at 10 plus minutes of exercise that is moderate to high intensity. And these cortisol levels can continue to be elevated for up to 2 hours after the exercise is over. There are a lot of studies that suggest that cortisol is good for us, because stress isn't always a bad thing. Moderate increases in cortisol have actually been shown to enhance working memory. But there are also studies that suggest that cortisol elevation past a certain point can impair memory. And I think that's why the TikTok girlies love it so much, is they like to blame cortisol on things because too much of it can be potentially detrimental. But that's just an example of how cortisol is released during exercise, how it's released during exercise, and in certain amounts, it can actually improve our working memory. In addition to cortisol, we're also going to talk about neurotrophins and growth factors. So acute exercise can cause peripheral elevations in neurotrophins and growth factors, like the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF, or the insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, or the vascular endothelial growth factor, VEGF-1. So these are all things that you don't really need to know the general function of, but essentially each of these factors promote brain cell health and function, either directly or indirectly, depending on which one you're talking about. So they each contribute to neuronal growth and function, and basically helps our brain cells work better. So the review paper talks about studies that have shown peripheral elevations, and basically what that means is that instead of looking directly in the brain at these growth factors, they're taking blood samples or other, I think in these cases it was blood samples, as a proxy to what's actually going on inside the brain. So with short-term acute exercise, peripherally, we're seeing increases in these growth factors, which scientists kind of use as a proxy to say, okay, if these things are elevated peripherally, they're probably elevated in the brain. And if they're elevated in the brain, that means that they're promoting the growth and function of brain cells. So that's kind of the thought there. Next on the list, we have dopamine. The studies that are cited in the review article really talk about rodents, and actually for both dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine and serotonin, I think, are two of the more common neurotransmitters that you've heard of. I think those are they're closer to our vernacular, I think, than BDNF or VEGF. But basically, in rodents, increases in dopamine in regions like the hippocampus, the prefrontal cortex, the striatum, and the midbrain were found with activity, with exercise. And these levels return to the baseline value before exercise after about 2 hours. And I think that kind of makes sense. It's sort of like short-term gratification, like the runner's high, where like you kind of, dopamine makes you happy, and it's like part of your reward system as well. So it kind of is a motivation, reward, elevated feelings. So it's kind of like a dopamine hit, quote unquote, from exercise. Another neurotransmitter that may have some effects from exercise is serotonin. So there were some studies in rodents, not all, but some studies have reported increases in serotonin in regions like the frontal cortex, the hippocampus, the striatum, and the midbrain. I think the overall consensus that this review paper kind of touches on is that it's not as clear how serotonin is directly impacted by exercise. And the reason for the uncertainty in this relationship is really because the studies have been really variable, again, for things like the intensity and the duration of the exercise that was part of the study. And then the last thing here is endorphins. Endorphins. I'm sure this is what everybody was waiting for. Endorphins make people happy, and happy people don't kill their husbands. So that's not even the whole quote. It's actually, exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make people happy. Happy people don't kill their husbands. Legally Blonde. If you don't know it, you should. Go watch Legally Blonde. Turn this off and go watch Legally Blonde. So endorphins, at least in this review article, were kind of broken up into two different groups of endogenous opioids and endocannabinoids. So when you see ENDO, or at least when I see ENDO, I always think of like within. So something like an endogenous opioid is going to be a chemical that is an opioid, but it's made from within our own bodies. Same thing with endocannabinoids, right? It's a cannabinoid similar to some like the chemical makeup of cannabis, but it's endo. It's like from within our own system. So this study really touches on the endogenous opioids, this paper touches on the endogenous opioids and endocannabinoids and their impact with exercise. So when we're talking about endogenous opioids, there are really three families of these endogenous opioids. The first is beta endorphins, which I think is kind of like the endorphins that we all know and refer to. The second is I'm not even going to try to pronounce these. Sorry, dynorphins. And I feel like this might be a typo in my notes because it's ankphelins. I think that's a typo. Sorry to that man. Regardless, each of these endogenous opioids are involved with things like pain modulation, responding to stress, reward, those sorts of things. So the hypothesis here is that the runner's high that we feel after exercise is really caused by, or really driven by, this increase that we see in the endogenous opioids post exercise. And there's actually a study done, a PET imaging study that was done that looked at opioid receptors after intense exercise. And what they found was that in this study, where they had male athletes run for 2 hours, so it's pretty intense exercise, got a PET scan. And what they found was that the measures of euphoria, these like good feelings, the runner's high after a workout, were correlated with the estimated measures of opioid concentrations in the brain based on the PET image that they took. Which I think kind of supports this idea that the runner's high is really impacted or driven by the opioid system, the endogenous opioid system in the brain. But in addition to the endogenous opioids, there's also these endocannabinoids that are also believed to play a role in the runner's high. So endocannabinoids are a family of lipids that are involved also with pain processing, but also things like memory, mood, appetite. If you've worked with cannabis before, you may be familiar with how it impacts your mood and your appetite and your memory. Just a thought. Your endocannabinoids are also quite involved in those systems as well. And studies have shown that acute exercise can increase the peripheral levels of endocannabinoids in your blood. And they actually found that moderate exercise had the greatest effect on this like runner's high euphoria, which is interesting. So don't go crazy. Challenge yourself, but don't go crazy. Moderate exercise had the greatest effect here in increasing the peripheral levels of endogenous cannabinoids in your system. There you go. So we finally have made it to the end of question 1. I promise question 2 is faster. But to summarize question 1, if you're going to go out and exercise today, no pressure, but if you do, you can go for a walk, a jog, a swim, bike ride, lift some weights, whatever. We now know that our mood and cognition can improve slightly. Our brain will function a little bit better because we'll impact the blood flow to certain parts of our brain. And a bunch of our neurochemicals will be elevated, including but not limited to some of our endogenous opioid and endocannabinoids. So good to know. Not bad for like 30 minutes to an hour, maybe, if you feel like it. It's not bad. Pretty cool, I think. So that's all for like the short-term effects of exercise on the brain. But now we're going to move on to question number 2, which is talking about the long-term effects. What happens if today I go out and I exercise and I actually really enjoy it, and then I do it again tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, and I just do it forever until I croak? That's such a harsh way to say die, but I thought it would have been nicer, but I don't think it is actually. Whatever. What happens if I exercise every day for the rest of my life, or, most days for the rest of my life? What's going to happen to my brain when I do that? So the next review article by Macpherson and colleagues, which I'll talk about for the rest of the episode, really talks about the longitudinal effects of exercise on the brain at different stages of life. So including childhood and adolescence, and then getting into more midlife in like your 40s and 50s, and then late life, which is after 65. So starting with youth, childhood, I was reading this and I was like, oh, I'm probably closer to like adolescence than I am to midlife. I'm not. Midlife is 40 to 65. I'm going to be 32 in the summer. Sorry. Yikes. Anyway, edit that out. I didn't want anyone to know that. Just kidding. Okay. So starting in childhood and adolescence, early life is a very, very, very important time for your brain. There's a lot of changes, a lot of growth, a lot of development that's happening in your brain, specifically in both the gray matter and the white matter of your brain. So the gray matter of your brain, which is also sometimes known as cortex, these are like usually the outer layers of the brain that there's a lot of neuronal cell bodies in this area of the brain. There's a lot of brain cells in this area. And then the white matter, which is usually more inside the brain, that is where the projections of the neurons are. So less of the cell bodies and more of like the ropes that connect different regions of the brain are the white matter. So both the cell bodies themselves and their projections, so the gray and the white matter, are both developing during childhood, and they're both very, very important for proper brain function. So a lot of the research looking at brain studies in children focus on gray matter and white matter, and really looking at the amount of gray matter or the volume of gray matter, looking at the structure of white matter and seeing what really that looks like as they're developing. So the brain imaging studies that look at this in children have shown that kids who have a better cardiovascular fitness level, which here is like an indirect measurement of physical activity, they had greater volumes of certain gray matter regions of the brain, like the hippocampus, which is important for memory, as well as the dorsal striatum, which is important for attention. And they also found that the structural properties, and specifically the microstructure of the white matter, is related to cardiorespiratory fitness in children also. So the takeaway here is that in children, exercise is related to brain structure and brain volume overall, or really gray matter volume and white matter structure, if we don't want to generalize too much, because we don't want to generalize too much. So that's for childhood, is that better cardiovascular fitness, which is an indirect measurement of physical activity, will result in improved measurements of brain structure in children. So now we're going to move on to midlife and late life. We're kind of grouping these two together, even though the paper talks about them separately, but I feel like overall it was kind of similar in my opinion. In midlife, which is they defined as ages 40 to 65-ish, you might think that like these people are adults, you know, they're perfectly fine, right? 40 is not old, right? I'm almost there. But no, you think that like this isn't the point in your life where you'd expect like a decline in brain function. They're fully functional grown adults, right? But there are some cognitive domains that do start to decline in midlife. Not severely, but studies have shown that some functions start their decline in midlife. Things like cognitive speed, reasoning, memory, these can all begin to decline and not be impaired by any means, but just like not be as strong as they used to be, you know? And I think if you ask any 50-year-old, they'd be like, yeah, I'm not what I used to be, which is sad and a little scary. But I definitely have heard 50-year-olds say that before. So, but otherwise, like general knowledge, general information, speech, vocabulary, like those are all standard throughout midlife. But there are just some of those cognitive domains like speed, like processing speed, that sort of thing that can slow down a little bit in midlife. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that the rate at which those things change and the degree to which those things change is not the same for everyone, right? Some people barely have any changes, and some people, they're like, oh, I'm really starting to notice something different happening here, right? And the fact that this is different for different people suggests that it might be impacted by factors like education level. It might be impacted by things like social determinants of health. And it might be impacted by physical activity. So changes that happen during midlife, they can be both functional and structural. So both gray and white matter volumes also decline naturally as we age. And interestingly, an observational study out of Finland found that people who had more active lifestyles, they just reported being more active in life, they had larger brain volumes in mid to late life than people who lived more sedentary lifestyles. And this was determined with MRI imaging. So they asked people, how active are you? Do you live an active lifestyle? Are you more sedentary? And then they got an MRI and looked at the volume of their brain, the gray matter, the white matter. And they found that generally people who lived more active lifestyles had larger brain volumes later in life. And most of this larger brain volume was accounted for by elevated gray matter volume. So it's mostly driven by those high gray matter volumes, which again is where the brain cells are. Those are where those cell bodies are. And if there's a larger volume, I think it's kind of implied, maybe the assumption is that those brain cells, those neurons, those cell bodies are plump and healthy and working good, which is what we want. So that's, I think, my takeaway from that is, okay, being more active later in life keeps your brain big. Maybe that's oversimplifying it, but that's how I'm reading it. You got to keep your brain big. The exact mechanism by how and why this keeps your brain big is not really well characterized, but it is well reported. So I think even when we get into later life, over 65, some of us might be familiar that people over 65 tend to notice cognitive changes a lot more than in their midlife. And again, this degree of cognitive decline really does change depending on the person. Again, different environmental factors, education, social determinants of health. But in this study, in this paper, they talk about physical activity, right? So there's some studies that suggest that the variability in cognitive decline as we age across people could be caused by differences in physical activity, where one study looked at physical activity in midlife and beyond and determined that physical activity in midlife and later is actually a predictor of cognitive function in old age, where the more active you are in midlife and beyond, the better your cognition would be later in life. And in a different study, they saw that higher levels of physical activity in seniors and people over 65 were also associated with greater global brain volume as well as greater hippocampal volume. And the hippocampus is one of the brain regions that's responsible for memory. So if that's big and plump, odds are that's working good, right? So I think that's really important to note here too. So essentially in mid to late life, there's evidence that regular physical activity and living a more active lifestyle is related to a plump, healthy, structurally sound brain that has as good of cognitive function as can be. That's my takeaway, is that now that I'm approaching midlife, if I stay active, I'm going to do the best for my brain to keep it plump and healthy and to keep it working as good as it can hopefully. Fingers crossed here. So that's all for question 2. That's the last question of this episode. Freaking finally. I know. It's been a minute. But before I go, we do have some takeaways. I'll keep them quick though. First, exercise is good for our brains in the short term, in the acute exercise, right? It improves our concentration and our mood. It improves our brain activity, all good things. Exercise is also good for us long term, right? Because studies have shown that the brain structure and cognitive function hold up better over time in people who are active compared to people who live more sedentary lifestyles. So my main takeaway here is that I highly recommend, as something that I've done in the past couple of years, is find a form of exercise you like and stick with it for the motivation for keeping your brain happy, keeping your brain healthy, keeping your brain functioning, because moving your body is good for your brain. So move it in whatever way excites you and makes you feel good, because you and your brain and your body are worth it. And it doesn't have to be like an Olympic level sport, right? Like it could be going for a walk. You can lift heavy weights if you want to. You can run super fast if you want to, but it could be, taking yoga classes. It could be watching a Pilates YouTube video. It could be having a dance party in your kitchen. I have one-person dance parties in my kitchen all the time. That's moving your body in a way that's fun and enjoyable. It could be riding your bike when it's nice outside. It could be anything. Just being active, moving your body, getting your heart pumping a little bit. It's all good. So the TLDR, the barely listen to this episode, what is the takeaway, is perfectly stated by our girl Elle Woods. I said it before and I'll say it again. Exercise gives you endorphins. Endorphins make people happy. Happy people don't shoot their husbands. So just putting that out there. Just so you know. I know we all know it. I know we all love it. But this is the truth. Thank you, Elle. From the iconic 2001 film starring Reese Witherspoon, Legally Blonde. So that's all for this episode. Let me know what you think. Was it interesting? Did you enjoy it? Did you kind of want me to shut up halfway through? Did you even make it to the end? Probably not. I rambled a lot, but we made it together. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you thought it was interesting. If you want to hear more about this, like exercise and the heart, or exercise and bone health, or whatever, I've done a lot of reading. So if you're interested and you want to learn more and you want more motivation that's like helping your body when you exercise, let me know. And I'd be happy to do another episode talking about bone health or muscle health or heart health, etc. All right. That is all for this week's episode. This annual quarter episode. But don't worry, I'll be back. Hopefully not in 3 months. Hopefully sooner than 3 months. But in the meantime, between now and when the next episode comes out, please don't forget to follow, rate, and review the podcast wherever you listen. And you can subscribe on YouTube if you haven't yet. You can also follow the show on, I think, honestly, Instagram and TikTok are the ones that I'll spend the most time on. It does also have a Blue Sky account, but I honestly downloaded Blue Sky, never opened it. Even for my personal accounts, I've never used it. But maybe I will. If you have it, you can follow the show there, and then if there are enough followers, I'll post on it. Maybe. No promises. But definitely connect with me on Instagram and TikTok and ask me questions there if you'd like. If you want to learn more about certain things, you can let me know there. You can also submit your questions at samsplainingsci.com/ask. So if you have anything that you want samsplained to you, you can ask right there. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you've learned a little bit and laughed a little bit, and I will talk to you next time. Bye.